sound system.
Here.
Tom Chapa,
Here.
Heather Del Conte,
Here.
Pamela Dowd,
Here.
Lisa Glidden,
Here.
James McKenzie,
Here.
Linda Serino,
Here.
Zeta Olson.
Here.
And tonight we also have Sean Onmack joining us, and you can go ahead with the presentation, Dr. Calvin.
All right, Dan, you can go ahead and put that up, please. A second there. Okay. Dan, if you can just place that in the, go ahead and put it in the play mode so we can go ahead and get going with that. Dan, can you just press the from beginning button there? Can you hear me okay? Let's see. Dan, Rupert, can you hear me okay there? Can you all hear me? You can hear me? Not sure what's going on. 1 second, board. Karen's calling them now.
Mathis, is this a publicized workshop?
Yes, it is.
Okay, just making sure everyone realizes that.
Yes.
Thanks.
Is that what you wanted, Dr. Calvin?
Yes, I want him to go ahead and start press play so we can start the PowerPoint.
Okay, let me get them again for you. Just one moment.
All right. Okay, Dan, we're going to go ahead and get started. Maybe he has to start that again. 1 moment. All right, board. I want to thank you all for coming on tonight. At our last Board of Education meeting, we did have a request to have a workshop on reserves. Each year at the end of the year, whenever there is amounts that are left over, the board certainly has choice as to where the board might like to have those funds go to. They could either go to reserves or to whatever other items that the board might be interested in. And so as we were talking a little bit at the last board meeting, one of our board members asked, can we have a workshop on reserves? And tonight we're here to provide that support and information to the board. Okay, Dan, go ahead to the next slide, please. All right, so first off, then, I think we'll start out with just defining why do we have reserves and also what reserves are. So Nancy, you're on with us. Can you just share a little bit with us about what are reserves? And then we'll go over the slide that talks about why do we have them.
Sure. So reserves are actually savings accounts for specific purposes. And they are funded through surplus funds from the general fund. And we have them because they provide a long-term benefit to the district without creating a structural budget imbalance. Well, what does that mean? That means that reserves can help fund expenditures in the balance based on a plan. And they can be also used to buy down future expenses or pay for one-time costs that are in the budget. So reserves are our rainy day fund.
Right. Dan, you can go to the next slide. And Nancy, can you talk a little bit about some of the political considerations that certainly are a part of whenever we think about reserves?
Sure. So there's always the thought that if we have excess funds at the end of the year, that should be used to reduce our levy. And that is only providing an issue down the road. It's postponing, by doing that, you're actually postponing difficult choices to another time. because if you don't keep your levy at a certain amount, down the road, there may be some large fluctuations. And we really try to prevent that from happening to taxpayers. So all decisions regarding reserves and funding funding reserves through surpluses should be made with long-term consequences in mind. The state comptroller states planning today and saving incrementally for expended future events can help mitigate the financial impact of major non-recurring or unforeseen expenditures on your annual operating budget.
All right. So there are some true benefits to reserves. Reserves can reduce the need to plan for unexpected things that come up in annual operating budgets. Reserves provide a tool to smooth out the peaks and the valleys in certain parts of districts' budgets. And they can also allow the district to repay certain types of expenses. If an emergency comes up, depending on what reserve it is from, you will have also some additional funds available to help you with getting through challenges that might be considered to be emergent. Okay, go ahead, Dan. So how are reserves funded? Nancy, go right ahead, please.
So they can be funded through surplus funds from under expenditures of the general fund budget, or if we have a large increase in revenue over our projected budget. Money that approved by the voters. So some of our reserves allow money to be deposited through the approval by the voters in the annual operating budget. State aid. The voters have authorized the Board of Education to fund several reserves with a portion of state aid receipts. Deposits required by law, premiums on bond proceeds, and unexpended capital project funds must be deposited in the debt service fund. And interest income on money on any reserve fund stays within those reserves.
Okay, all right. So a variety of ways then that you can go about funding reserves. So currently we do have a number of reserves in our district, and these are those reserves and their amounts. The first is the Workers' Compensation Reserve, and that amount is funded at $355,401. The Unemployment Insurance Reserve that we have is at $3,374,665. The Employee Retirement Systems Reserve is funded at $2,526,774. Our Teacher Retirement Reserve at $550,000. Our liability insurance reserve is funded at $1,570,838. Our tax certiorari reserve at $1,034,491. Our post-employment benefit reserve currently at $2,195,240, and our capital reserve at $75,042. The total amount currently in our reserves, $11,682,451. Now, with respect to reserves, we want to kind of go over now and just explain each of those reserves, but also reserves that the board might like to consider in the future. These are not the only reserves that boards can have across the state. So we'll go down each of the reserves and just explain them to you now. Okay? So we'll start first with the Workers' Compensation Reserve. By the way, we had some questions prior to the board meeting about, are there any limits that can go into those reserve amounts? And tonight we will share with you some of those limits and information, and those will be highlighted in blue on our slides. Okay? All right, Nancy, can you talk a little bit about the Workers' Comp Reserve, please?
Sure. Because the district is self-funded for workers' comp, we have a workers' comp reserve, and that's used to pay the benefits, hospital expenditures, medical expenditures, and self-insurance administration costs provided by the workers' comp law. And it is a reserve that is created through board action, and it is funded by appropriations and other funds as may be legally appropriated. What that means is surpluses and everything that we talked about in the previous slide. And the funds remaining in excess of requirements to pay pending claims may be transferred within 60 days of the close of the fiscal year to other reserves or applied to the next succeeding fiscal year's budget.
Okay. All right. Our second reserve is the unemployment insurance reserve. And the purpose of this reserve is to reimburse the state's unemployment fund for payments made to claimants when municipalities have elected to use the benefit reimbursement method. Nancy, you want to go ahead and share more on that reserve, please?
Sure. Again, we only pay for unemployment claims. We are self-funded for unemployment insurance. We don't need a referendum to create or expend money from the reserve. And it is funded again by appropriations that may be legally appropriated, as in the previous slides. And this is also just like the workers' comp reserve, where you can transfer excess within 60 days of the close of the fiscal year, or apply any money to the next fiscal year's budget.
Jim, you had a question?
So just a clarification, if you could, Nancy, for some of these accounts, the last one, the workers' comp and this unemployment, we have these as reserves, but each year we also have these as a budgeted line item. That's correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so each year as part of our normal budget, we budget in a certain amount of money that theoretically, hopefully, pays for our annual expenditure in these areas, and that these reserves would only be used in emergency situation above and beyond that for that particular purpose.
That is correct. Or if we were in an extremely tight budget year, you may use some of your reserves to offset those costs. So for example, say we were in a budget deficit position and we were looking for ways to help because the revenue was not coming in to support our budget. We could offset unemployment insurance claims with the added revenue from the unemployment insurance reserve. But you could only do that to the extent of the expenses in the general fund budget. So for example, if you budgeted $100,000 for your unemployment insurance reserve, but the actual expenditures only came in at $50,000, you would only be allowed to offset the revenue by $50,000 from the unemployment insurance reserve.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
All right, great. Okay, go ahead to the next slide there, Dan. All right, so the next reserve here is the teacher retirement system reserves. And some of the reserves have certain limits or amounts or percentages that can go into them. So this is the first of one of those reserves that has specifics that is placed on it. The reserve was established back in 2019, and this amendment authorizes a Board of Education by resolution to establish a sub-fund within its retirement contribution reserve fund to finance retirement contributions to the New York State Teacher Retirement System, known as TRS, and or to offset all or some of the amounts deducted from the monies apportioned to the district from the state under the Education Law 521. Nancy, can you go ahead and talk a little bit about the contributions annually and also the resolution piece that's involved with this reserve?
Sure. This is a relatively new reserve. It is actually a sub-fund of the ERS reserve, which is the Employee Retirement System Reserve. And it cannot exceed 2% of the total compensation of this teacher's salaries employed by the district from the preceding year, nor can the balance exceed 10% of the total compensation of salaries of all teachers employed by the district who are members of the TRS paid immediately preceding the fiscal year. So we do have some restrictions on how we can fund this and the maximum we can fund it at.
And then you want to go over the resolution piece there, the school board, how they may authorize the transfer? Go ahead.
Sure. So by resolution, the school board may authorize the transfer of monies from the Retirement Contribution Reserve Fund into the sub-fund or vice versa, subject to the limits noted on the annual payments of the sub-fund. And so the sub-fund comes from the Employee Retirement System. Dr. Calvin, I'm not sure if you have that in this slide. It might have been in a previous iteration.
It's here. It's coming up soon.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Okay. All right. Okay.
Oh, there it is.
Go. Employee Retirement System, ERS now. Why don't you go over ERS, Nancy? Go ahead.
Okay. So ERS is the Employees Retirement Service Fund. and it is used to pay for New York State local and retirement system, their retirement and their retirement benefits under the Retirement and Social Security law. It was created, expenditures authorized by board resolution of the governing board to finance retirement contributions. A referendum is not required either to create or expend money from the reserves, and transfers from or back to other reserve funds require a public hearing within 50 days notice to be published in the official newspapers. So you're not restricted on spending money from the reserves, but if you are going to transfer that money to another reserve, it does require a hearing.
Okay. All right. The next reserve we have is an insurance reserve. It does have some requirements that go with it as well. There's a certain amount that can be paid into this reserve, and that there's also a certain amount that can't be exceeded. And really the purpose of the insurance reserve is to fund certain uninsured losses or claims or actions or judgments for which the local government is authorized or required, the school district in this case, is authorized or required to purchase or maintain insurance with a number of exceptions. Go ahead, Nancy.
So it's created by resolution from the board, and a referendum is not required in this case either to create or expend money from the reserve. The amount paid into the reserve during any fiscal year may not exceed the greater of $33,000 or 5% of the total budget of the fiscal year. There's no limit on the cash balance. It's determined that the fund is no longer needed. The money can be transferred to another reserve fund authorized under general municipal law, or in the case of a school district, a reserve fund established under educational law, but only to the extent that the monies in the fund exceed a sum sufficient to pay all the liabilities incurred or accrued against the fund as certified.
Okay, all right. All right. The next reserve also has some specific criteria to it as well. And that's the tax to sorcery reserve, and established through Chapter 588 of the law of 1988, which was amended by Section 3651 of the Education Law. And the goal is to permit, the district, to permit the establishment of a reserve fund for tax to sorcery and to expend from the fund without voter approval of qualified voters of the school district. Nancy, go right ahead. This is one of the reserves, by the way, that from time to time school districts will have to, do some operation with because it involves tax to sorcery claims. Go ahead, Nancy.
So we have used this fund in the past when we were out and we had a claim with 9 Mile 1 and 9 Mile 2. At that time, there was almost $7 million in the tax certiorari account. Now it's just over $1 million, and the money should not exceed what we anticipate in judgments and claims in tax certiorari proceedings. The money that's deposited in the reserve fund, which are not expended for tax certiorari proceedings in the year, they must be returned to the general fund on or before the first day of the fourth fiscal year after deposit of these monies into the reserve, unless there are claims still open.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, the next reserve is what we call the post-employment benefit reserve. And this reserve is set up to pay for any accrued employee benefits due to an employee on termination of the employee's service. Go ahead, Nancy.
So A is for the cash payment of monetary value of accumulated sick or accrued or unused sick leave, holiday leave, vacation leave, time allowance granted in lieu of overtime compensation, and other forms of accrued leave and benefits due to an employee on termination or separation from the district. The reasonable cost of the administration of the reserve fund can be included, and expert or professional services rendered in connection with the investigation, adjustment, or settlement of claims, actions, or judgments relating to claims for the accrued employee benefits. It's created by a resolution of the governing board. A referendum is not required to create or expend money from the reserve, and unused funds may be transferred to any other reserve fund.
Okay, all right. Capital Reserve Fund. This is one that we certainly have become very familiar with here in Oswego City School District. Go ahead, Nancy.
So the capital reserve fund is used to pay for the cost of any object or purpose for which bonds may be issued. Propositions have to be put before the voter and before amounts are deposited into the reserve. And there has to be a probable term of life and source of funds. As I said, voter approval is required to spend from this reserve, and expenditures must be specific. So capital reserve to purchase school buses or facilities construction or for equipment. We just reauthorized this fund, I believe, 3 or 4 years ago. I don't have the exact date in front of me. And so when it expires, you actually have to reauthorize the reserve, and which is creating a new reserve and moving the money from the one reserve into the other reserve. Annual appropriations to fund reserves are authorized by the voters. The creation of a capital reserve fund requires authorization by a majority of the voters. The forms of the required legal notice for the vote on establishing and funding the reserves and of the proposition to be placed on the ballot are both set forth in education law. It's limited to the term of the life approved by the voters and may extend the term only before the end date. The reserves, if the reserve is defunct after the terms expire, expect to spend the remaining funds with voter approval.
Okay, all right. The next reserve is really in a group of what I call reserves that could be created, but they certainly are things that will have to have specific elements in place. This next reserve is called a Nuclear Stabilization Reserve. It is a reserve that was put into place pursuant to Chapter 202 of the laws of 2001. And really it's for those districts who have nuclear power plants within them. And these districts can establish a nuclear facility tax stabilization reserve fund in preparation of some things happening with their plants. So Nancy, go ahead and talk a little bit about nuclear stabilization reserves.
So the district does have a nuclear stabilization reserve. However, it has $0 in it. It's available. It was actually created the last time to prevent any projected increase in the amount of real property tax levy needed to finance the general fund budget when 9 Mile 1 and 9 Mile 2 are no longer there. It's funded with budgetary appropriations subject to the limitations set forth in the law. It can only be funded with an escalating pilot to the extent of the annual increase. So for example, if we received a pilot payment from Exelon of 25 million, and then next year it's 25 million, we have no mechanism in the fund and nuclear stabilization reserve. However, if a nuclear payment is 25 million and the next year it's 25,500,000, the board could say, I want to take that $500,000 and fund the nuclear stabilization reserve. There is some information out there where we can ask our legislatures to change the law to allow us to fund this, but so far that hasn't been successful.
Heather had a question.
Yeah, my question is, so I understand the mechanism for which you put money into it. Is there a limit to how much you can store there?
No.
No.
And then is the point of that to have enough money to, indefinitely make up for that lost taxes? Or is it more like because it does feel like spitting into a lake. So I just wondered if, is it just supposed to be a Band-Aid for a little while, or what is the purpose?
Yes. I think you kind of summarized it. Yes, for most districts, it's really trying to absorb the loss that they would have in future revenue because the power plants go out of business. So it is kind of like a temporary Band-Aid until districts have a chance to look at other ways to bring in revenue that they might be losing because of the power plants. Nancy, did you have anything, an agreement or something different from that?
No, that's correct. It's just used to stabilize the tax levy when these are no longer producing revenue.
So is there guidance as either from the state or just good practice in terms of how much would be a good amount percentage wise to our budget to have in this account? understanding their,
Yeah.
situation.
No, and unfortunately, I actually reached out to our auditors and I asked that question about, is there a maximum or a minimum in terms of how you can fund any of these reserves? And he said, no, it's different by district. They don't provide any minimum or maximum guidelines from the state controller's office.
Right. Yeah. So most districts who have had to deal with nuclear stabilization issues, right, it's kind of really up to what their individualized issue is that they're going through in their district. In most cases, they try to get as much as they can into that reserve, because when that money goes from the nuclear power plants, it's a huge steep hill to try to climb up for the taxpayers, basically. But no, I have not seen any kind of suggested amount that you should try to put into it. What I've always been told is the maximum amount that you can, when you know your power plants are going out of business, that's what you should do. Okay. Jim, you had a question, sir? Excuse me, Heather, did we answer your question?
Maybe it's a, okay, good. Maybe it's a question / comment. Other nuke plants have closed in areas. I'm not sure where, but I know the number has gone down. I think it would be good to try to investigate some into that and see what the difference is, because, and this kind of where more of the questions from, when it's talked about when these shut down and it goes away. Right. Right now we're getting a pilot, which is they're giving us money in lieu of taxes, right? So we're getting a chunk amount that we've negotiated with them through our different municipalities. But when they close that piece of property is still owned by somebody. It is still worth something. And when it goes back on the tax roll, theoretically, I would think we're getting something from them by basis of tax payment. Because again, even though you may not be operating as a nuke plant, the amount of time it takes to decommission, it can't be worthless land. So, I guess that's kind of my question. We wouldn't lose everything, is that we would lose a proportion of something.
Right. Well, it really, each situation is different. From my former experience, having worked in a district with a plant that is now getting ready to close, basically, each district is different. So it depends a lot on how the land has been used, where things are stored, what people would like to redevelop the land as. So for example, one district that I know in New York has used a lot of its land in past years to store toxic kind of waste underground. And so how much is that land worth once the plant closes, right? It's not worth a lot because no one wants to build a playground or a house or anything else on that land. So it's all dependent on a number of items as to how the land has been used, what people, what the company did with it in the past, and what it could be used for in the future. I agree with you, Jim. That certainly is something that we want to look at. There are several districts around the state. New York City has a couple of folks that have dealt with this. I know of Dunkirk, which is out near the Buffalo area, that had a nuclear power plant that closed. North Tonawanda had, I think it was a coal plant that closed, but had some similarities in terms of how it was dealt with. But there are some case studies out there that we can kind of look at. At our next workshop, what I'd like to do is have Mr. Tom Zuber come in and talk a little bit about nuclear stabilization reserves and what's out there and things that we need to think about. He does have some expertise and background in dealing with some of that those matters, basically. So certainly an item to investigate, because could the district be in trouble if plants were to close? It all depends on what land was used, like what were the purposes. It could be. Sometimes the property values go down significantly when a nuclear power plant closes, because who wants to live or do things on a plant, right? So, hope I answered your question.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's when you see the train coming, you want to get off that track.
There you go.
And this is really a tangible timeline. So I'm glad we're talking about it now. Thank you.
Okay, Dan. So there's some additional reserves that we don't have, but that we could create, and we'll talk a little bit about some more of those. I'm sorry, Tom. I apologize. Did you have a question, Tom? I saw your hand raised.
Yeah, I did, Mathis. I just want to say one thing. We're in kind of a unique situation with 9 Mile 1, 9 Mile 2, and Fitzpatrick. We have 3 nuclear power plants versus 1 going down. But it does give us the opportunity, because 2029 is 9 Mile 1's scheduled date for decommissioning, or at least the beginning of it. So, and we have one more bite at the apple before that with negotiations for Exelon, correct, Nancy? We're in a 5-year.
5-year.
5-year. So we have one more time to, at that point, make sure that we do get either change the legislation prior to that for an increasing the language in the legislation so we can start funding at any time, or just do our homework relative to, say, Indian Point and the other nuclear areas that have already shut down. But it won't be, you're right, Jim, it won't be a going to zero. They still have to pay to maintain that land, and there will still be a tax revenue. But if we can build up an offset in those years and feather it over the years, because then we can look ahead to the next one and then the next one, which will be coming. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to put that in there as far as a timeline. That train is due in 2029.
And Tom, just to add to that, even if they do have to pay taxes, it's nowhere near, because of the way they calculate the
Right.
tax based on its utility, really, its value as a utility plant. You know what I mean? It really isn't going to be anything close to what they agree to pay now.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah, we should all be paying attention to what's happening at the Indian River plant.
Absolutely. Okay. Board, the next reserve is the repair reserve. And the repair reserve fund is used to pay for cost of repairs to capital improvement or equipment, which repairs are of a type of a non-recurring annually or it occurs in shorter intervals. Nancy, go ahead. You want to share about that?
Sure. So the repair reserve can be funded through budgetary appropriations or other revenues that are legally appropriated and are not required by law to be paid into any other fund account. Voter approval is required to fund this reserve. The unexpended balance may be transferred to the capital, tax certiorari, or retirement contribution reserves pursuant to education law and general municipal law. And the expenditures from this reserve may be made only after a public hearing has been held requiring 2/3 majority vote of the board, except in emergency situations. If no hearing is held, the amount expended must be repaid to the reserve fund over the next 2 subsequent fiscal years in a reserve for tax reduction.
Okay. All right. The next reserve is a reserve for tax reduction. Go ahead, Nancy.
So this reserve is used for the gradual use of proceeds from the sale of any of our real property, any of our buildings, where the proceeds are not required to be placed in a mandatory reserve for debt service. So right now, because all of our buildings have bonds on them, if we were to sell a building, all of that revenue would have to go into this mandatory reserve for debt service because we have bonds out on our buildings. Specifically, the district is permitted to retain the proceeds from the sale for a period not to exceed 10 years and to use them during that period for tax reduction.
Thank you. The next reserve does have some, again, specified amounts that can go kind of within that reserve, and it's really about property loss. Go ahead, Nancy.
So the funds are for this reserve are used to establish and maintain a program of reserves to cover property loss and liability claims incurred. Separate funds for property loss and liability claims are required. This type of reserve may be utilized only by school districts. Annual contributions are limited to 3% of the annual budget or $15,000, whichever is greater. They can't be used for any other purpose without voter approval, except the board may use money not required to settle pending claims to purchase insurance policies to cover losses previously self-insured. Balances may not be reduced below amounts required to settle all pending claims.
Okay.
So we are not self-insured for property loss. We do have insurance policies.
Okay. All right. Okay, board. So those are all of the reserves. Before I go on, are there any other questions before we move on now to projections right now for our fund balance and some additional information? Any questions about those different types of reserves? All right. So, what is in our current fund balance surplus, projection? So we are planning right now to end the year with around about a $2.5 million surplus. As we've kind of gone through the year, some of the things that we had projected because of COVID-19 were not needed. So we have at this point in time about 2.5 that it looks like we may end up with. This amount will not be determined until the final external audit is completed in August. Nancy, you want to talk a little bit about the other bullets, please?
Sure. So what we do at the end of the year is we just make estimates for where those excess funds should be placed. What we consider is the flexibility of the reserve. Could we get the money out if there was an emergency? We saw this happen last year during COVID-19 when we went to one-to-one devices. So we look at that, and unemployment reserve, workers' comp reserve, those reserves are very flexible, and we're able to get money. The board is able to transfer money out of those reserves with relative ease. We'll look at, is there a low reserve balance? Now, TRS is a relatively new reserve. It only has $550,000 in it. So to me, that's a low reserve balance. So that's what I would look at for that. Or what are the future needs of the district, i.e. the nuclear stabilization reserve? What can we do in order to start going and trying to change the legislation to provide a mechanism so that we can start to fund that reserve?
Great. Go ahead. So generally, the estimates to the fund reserves come to the board in June of each year. Some districts, they come to a little bit later in each year. But generally, in this district, they've come in June. And the board can approve the recommendations that are on the agenda or on the table, or they can table them. Tonight, we have some recommendations that have been put out there, but those could be tabled until July, our next meeting, or until the board is ready. In fact, I would encourage the board to take some time to think through where you'd like to certainly see all your reserves to go to. At our next workshop, we're going to have Mr. Tom Zuber from Mingo, Metzer, and Barr. And he's going to speak a little bit more on our reserves and answer any additional questions that the board might have. He has history of auditing our reserves and being able to share with us a little bit of how we've been using things and also some insight in terms of where we might want to, areas we might want to consider. We want the board to know that we are currently in the process of developing a framework in terms of for a reserve plan that the board, we'd like the board to certainly kind of think about. One of the things that we do need, I think Nancy and I have talked about this, what's really clear is that we need to have a reserve plan where we outline for the public and for everyone, what are the reserves? How can they be used? How can you, access them? And then what's our plans for each of the reserves so that people will kind of know where the Board of Education is headed with respect to reserves. So we are in the process of developing a framework for that and some information on that we would like to share with the board. We'd like to bring that back at July 13th. Now you should know, can you go to the next slide there, Dan? That when you look at these reserves, that there has been at least some money earmarked prior to COVID-19. Nancy, you want to talk a little bit about the amount that went into the unemployment reserve for capital improvement or capital projects for the future there originally? And what happened?
So, and it wasn't this board, it was a previous board, but when we sold the Ed Center, that money was supposed to be put into a capital reserve. That's what I had remembered. And so we really put that revenue into the unemployment reserve as a holding spot for that money. Because as I said before, any money that is put into a capital reserve has to be voter approved.
Okay.
So we could do at the next budget, for the next budget year, we could take money from the unemployment insurance reserve and transfer that to the capital reserve for that intent, but that was never done.
Right. And part of why it wasn't done, you want to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and what happened there a year or so ago here?
It was partially due to COVID, and we were not sure what those expenditures were going to be like and what we would have to start paying out for expenditures. But the other piece was we didn't have the money right away. So we missed the deadline going to the voters to say, can we move that money? So that is always an option that the board can take if they so choose. But we would have to put it on as a referendum.
Tom, you have a question, sir? Okay.
Yeah, Nancy, would Tom Zuber be able to tell us, and I'm sure you would too, year over year, what our average use is for unemployment insurance reserve? So we'll be able to know that, so we can look at a healthy number to be there relative to how much surplus is in that reserve.
Mhm. So yes, and I have some information. I could provide that to the board in transmittal. John Edwards had gone back and looked at the uses of our reserves over the last year, so I can provide that to you. But it's not only what we use or have used. Remember, this is for those occasions where, for drastic emergencies. So for example, in a workers' compensation reserve, as I was talking to Tom Zuber, he said, you may have, say you had something traumatic happen in a building and maybe, God forbid, a wall fell down or something and people were injured. You would have workers' compensation claims. So that's more what it's for. It's not for just funding the budget. It's also for those major incidents that could happen down the road.
Yeah, I was just, the thing I was looking at, if we looked historically back to say 2016, was it, or when the major cuts were to the district, and what kind of impact it had there relative to unemployment insurance. So we could get look at the most historic situations which were drastic and the others, so we can find a happy medium. That's all.
Absolutely. Yes, we can provide that. We can certainly provide that for the board. Sure. So a historical background and usage. And Tom has been, he's been our auditor, so he certainly can help with providing that as well. Great. Heather?
Okay, I'm actually, Tom had my first part of my question, because I would really like to see how our reserves fleshed out that year when we were basically told we had nothing and we were trying to really collect ourselves and cut everything, known to our school district. My other question is, do you remember why we wanted to put the proceeds from the sale of the building into capital reserves? Was there a specific reason? It's my first question. And then secondly, is it possible to put anticipated funds on a referendum?
So in answer to your first question, from what I remember, I know that we wanted to make sure that with the capital project, that there was money in the capital reserve to offset any local share of any future project. So I think that's why the money from the sale of the Ed Center was talked about going into the capital reserve, because we knew that we were going to use whatever was in there for this capital project. And we did. We used $7 point something million in order to fund the transfer of the Ed Center offices over to Layton, and also for some other expenditures for the capital program or capital project.
Wait, say that again. We spent $7 million transferring.
Or actually, maybe it was 5 points. I can't remember off the top of my head. 5.6 million.
But how much did we make on the building that we sold in order to have to move the offices?
There was other money in there already, Heather, in the capital reserve, not only money from the sale of the Ed Center. So the board had, the previous board had started with surplus, knowing that the capital project was coming, starting to fund the capital reserve on an annual basis. So, and I'm thinking, I think we had $5.6 million in the capital reserve. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was a good amount of money in the capital reserve that we used to offset the local share of the $63 million project, which was why we were able to do it, and to make sure that that cost wasn't pushed onto the taxpayers.
But excuse me, Heather, was your question why we put the sale of the money into unemployment insurance reserve as opposed
No.
to?
She said she remembered the wishes of the board being capital reserve. So I was just kind of curious as to why. That's all.
Got you. Thank you.
Oh, did you ask this? Did you answer the second one? Can you put anticipated revenues on a referendum, or do you have to actually have it in hand?
That I'm not sure of, and I will follow up on that.
We'll check on that, and we'll certainly bring that back for the part 2. Okay? Tom, was your hand up there, sir? Yeah? Okay. All right, any other questions from the board? So again, this is where we're currently at right now. What we'd like to do is have the board just kind of take some time to think about areas that you might like to see, funds go into. So we made some preliminary recommendations, but I think it's important to kind of have some additional information before you make your final decision. So at our next meeting, we'd like to have Tom Zuber come back, on the 13th of July, that meeting, and share a little bit more with the board in terms of historical data and some suggestions as to areas we might want to think about with respect to reserves. Is there any other questions or thoughts or feedback from the board or comments? Everybody okay? All right. Well, I think that concludes the workshop that we have for you tonight. And we look forward to being back on the 13th with part 2 of this workshop. Okay? All right. I think we're all set. So looks like we have a couple minutes there, Heather. I think we're all good.
If everybody could move to the next invitation. Okay, thank you.
We are going to wait till 5 o'clock though, right?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Bye.